The brutal murder of Sheila Bellush. A quiet afternoon in Sarasota, Florida. Inside a suburban home, the sound of laughter fills the air. 4 little children, quadruplets, just 2 years old, are playing, their tiny feet pattering across the floor. Their mother, Sheila Bellush, watches over them, her eyes filled with love. Sheila had built a life of peace after years of struggle. She had escaped her controlling and abusive ex-husband Alan Blackthorne and found solace in a new marriage. But as she carried on with her day, she had no idea that a predator was lurking, watching, waiting. Outside, a man sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel. He wasn't there by accident. He had come for one reason only: to kill Sheila Bellush. This was not a crime of passion. It was a cold, calculated execution, a hit job planned down to the finest detail. Jose Luis Del Toro Jr., a 21-year-old hired hitman, pulled up in front of Sheila's house. He had traveled from Texas, carrying out orders given to him by Daniel Rocha, a middleman who had orchestrated the hit for Alan Blackthorne. Del Toro wore camouflage clothing, blending into the surroundings. He had already been in Sarasota for a day, scouting the area, learning Sheila's routine, and waiting for the right moment to strike. He checked his weapon, a .45 caliber handgun, and ensured his knife was within reach. The plan was simple: get in, kill Sheila, and leave. But the moment he stepped inside that house, everything changed. Inside, Sheila was going about her day. The quadruplets were playing nearby, unaware of the danger that had just entered their home. Del Toro crept in silently, his hands tightening around his weapon. But as he moved through the house, Sheila noticed something, a shadow, a presence that didn't belong. She turned around, and there he was. Her heart must have pounded as she locked eyes with her killer, a stranger in her home, a man with murder in his eyes. Sheila tried to run, but Del Toro was faster. He raised his .45 caliber handgun, aimed it at her head, and pulled the trigger. Bang! The bullet tore through Sheila's face, sending her crashing to the floor. Blood splattered across the room. But Del Toro wasn't finished. She was still alive. She was suffering. Her body twitched, her breath ragged, her eyes wide with terror. But Del Toro had come to finish the job. He pulled out his knife, cold, sharp, and merciless, and slashed her throat open. Sheila bled out on the floor, her final moments filled with unimaginable pain. Then, silence. The only sound was the quiet breathing of 4 innocent children, crawling toward their mother's lifeless body. The scene was horrifying. The toddlers, still too young to understand death, walked through their mother's blood. Tiny footprints stained the floor. Sheila had dressed them in life vests that morning, fearing they might fall into the backyard pool if she turned her back for just a moment. But now those same life vests were covered in blood. Her blood. As their mother lay there, the quadruplets touched her face, tried to wake her, cried for her to hold them one last time. But Sheila Bellush was gone. Hours later, the front door creaked open. Sheila's 13-year-old daughter, Stevie, had just come home from school. She called out for her mom, but got no response. She took a few steps forward, and then she saw it, her mother, lying in a pool of blood, her throat slit. The lifeless bodies of her baby siblings crawling in the horror. Panic took over. She grabbed the phone, shaking, her fingers barely able to press the buttons. 911 had come on. Through sobs, she screamed into the receiver. "My mom is dead. There's blood everywhere. My brothers and sisters are covered in it." On the other end, the dispatcher tried to calm her down, but nothing could undo what had just happened. A loving mother had been slaughtered in her own home. And this was only the beginning. 911 had barely ended when emergency responders rushed toward the Bellush home. What they found inside left even the most experienced officers shaken. The crime scene was drenched in blood, with tiny footprints trailing across the floor. In the center of it all, Sheila Bellush lay lifeless, her throat slashed, a gunshot wound to her face. Her quadruplets, still too young to understand the horror, clung to each other, crying. Detectives from the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office knew immediately that this was no ordinary crime. The sheer brutality of the attack suggested deep-rooted rage. But as they examined the scene, a disturbing realization set in. There was no sign of forced entry. Whoever had done this had either walked right in or had been let in. As forensic teams began collecting evidence, investigators turned their attention to the most immediate question: who would want Sheila Bellush dead? The answer to that question would unravel a web of betrayal, obsession, and murder for hire. One of the first steps in the investigation was speaking to Sheila's husband, Jamie Bellush. He had been at work during the murder, but detectives needed to rule him out as a suspect. His alibi was solid, and his heartbreak was genuine. He had loved Sheila deeply and had moved to Florida with her to escape her troubled past. It didn't take long for investigators to realize that the key to solving this crime lay in that very past. Attention quickly shifted to Sheila's ex-husband, Alan Blackthorne. A wealthy businessman from Texas, Blackthorne had a long history of controlling behavior. His relationship with Sheila had been anything but peaceful. After their divorce, Sheila had fought relentlessly for custody of their two daughters, Stevie and Daryl. And when she won, Blackthorne's fury only grew. Detectives discovered that Blackthorne had been tracking Sheila's every move, hiring private investigators to find out where she lived and what she was doing. It was clear that he hadn't let go of his obsession. But would he go as far as to have her killed? The biggest breakthrough came when investigators examined the crime scene. A single fingerprint smudged onto Sheila's clothes dryer stood out. It didn't match anyone in the family, which meant one thing: it belonged to the killer. Running the print through their database led detectives to a 21-year-old man from Texas, Jose Luis del Toro, Jr. He had a minor criminal record, but nothing that suggested he was capable of such a brutal act. The real question was, why would a young man from Texas travel all the way to Florida to murder a mother of 6? The answer lay in a series of connections that pointed directly back to Blackthorne. Investigators learned that del Toro had not acted alone. By the time authorities identified del Toro as the killer, he had already fled to Mexico. This set off an international manhunt. U.S. Marshals working alongside Mexican authorities tracked him down in Monterrey, Mexico, 10 days after the murder. But there was a problem. Mexico refused to extradite him unless the death penalty was taken off the table. Florida prosecutors, desperate to bring him to justice, agreed not to seek the death penalty. With that, del Toro was flown back to the U.S. to face trial. As del Toro sat in custody, detectives turned their attention to the bigger players. Rocha and Gonzalez were arrested in Texas and charged with conspiracy to commit murder. But there was still one final piece missing. Investigators knew he was the mastermind, but proving it would require unraveling the complex chain of events that led to Sheila Bellush's murder. The case was about to take a dramatic turn. Alan Blackthorne had everything: money, power, and influence. But there was one thing he couldn't control: Sheila Bellush. And that drove him to obsession, rage, and ultimately murder. Born in 1956, Alan Blackthorne built his fortune through a medical equipment business in Texas. On the surface, he appeared to be a wealthy, successful entrepreneur, but those who knew him closely saw another side. A man consumed by anger, manipulation, and an unrelenting need for control. When he met Sheila, she was young, full of life, and drawn to his charm. The two married in 1982 and had 2 daughters, Stevie and Daryl. But behind closed doors, their relationship was anything but perfect. Sheila's family and friends later recalled how Blackthorne's temper could turn violent, how his love often felt more like ownership. None of them expected the case to unravel as quickly as it did. The fingerprint left behind by del Toro was their first mistake. The swift arrests of Rocha and Gonzalez were their second. But the biggest mistake of all was underestimating the determination of law enforcement to bring them all down, including the man who ordered it all, Alan Blackthorne. The net was closing in, and soon Blackthorne himself would face justice. Sheila Bellush's murder shattered not just one family, but many. It left behind children without a mother, a husband without a wife, and families forever scarred by a crime driven by hatred and revenge. Sheila Bellush came from a loving and supportive family. Born as Sheila Lee Walsh on October 19, 1962, in Topeka, Kansas, she grew up in a warm household. Her family described her as a kind, strong-willed, and loving woman, someone who always put others before herself. Even after enduring an abusive marriage with Alan Blackthorne, she fought hard to build a better life for herself and her children. Her husband, Jamie Bellush, was devastated by her murder. He had built a new life with Sheila, moving with her to Florida in hopes of escaping her past and starting fresh. But in a single moment, everything was ripped away. Jamie was now left alone to raise their quadruplets along with Sheila's 2 daughters from her previous marriage. Sheila's eldest daughter, Stevie, was just 13 years old when she walked into that horrifying crime scene. She was the one who found her mother's body and called 911. No child should ever have to experience something so traumatic, and for Stevie, that moment would haunt her forever. After Sheila's death, her family took action to protect her children. Jamie Bellush decided to move with the quadruplets and one of Sheila's daughters to New Jersey, away from the painful memories of Florida. Sheila's other daughter, Daryl, was sent to live with relatives in Oregon. The family did everything they could to shield the children from the horrors of their mother's murder, but the scars would remain forever. On the other side of this tragedy was Alan Blackthorne's family. While he was the mastermind behind Sheila's murder, his actions also destroyed his own family. His daughters Stevie and Daryl lost not only their mother, but also their father, who would soon be sent to prison. Blackthorne's new wife and stepchildren also suffered in the aftermath. When the truth about his involvement in Sheila's murder came to light, it brought shame and devastation to his household. The man they knew as a wealthy, successful businessman was now exposed as a man who orchestrated a brutal killing out of revenge. Daniel Rocha, the middleman in the murder plot, had a family of his own. They never imagined that his involvement in crime would lead to a life sentence. His loved ones, like Blackthorne's, were forced to live with the consequences of his choices. Jose Luis del Toro Jr., the hitman who actually carried out the killing, had a mother and grandmother who had no idea he was about to become a murderer. When his name surfaced in connection with the crime, they were in shock and disbelief. His actions not only ruined his own future, but also brought pain and shame to those who once loved him. The ripple effects of Sheila Bellush's murder extended far beyond just her and Blackthorne. 2 families were torn apart, one by grief, the other by disgrace. But as the families struggled to move forward, the legal system was preparing for its final act. The case was about to go to trial, and justice was waiting. The trial of those responsible for Sheila Bellush's murder was about more than just justice. It was about exposing the dark and calculated plot that led to her death. With all the key players in custody, prosecutors began building an airtight case. The evidence was undeniable. After being extradited from Mexico, he pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and armed burglary. The court showed no mercy. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, a punishment that ensured he would never walk free again. Daniel Rocha, the middleman, tried to avoid a harsh sentence by shifting blame. He claimed the plan was only meant to scare Sheila, not kill her. But the jury saw through his lies. He was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy and sentenced to life in prison. Samuel Gonzalez, who helped connect Rocha with Del Toro, took a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against Rocha and Blackthorne, he was sentenced to 19 years in prison. But the most anticipated trial was that of Alan Blackthorne, the man who orchestrated everything from behind the scenes. His wealth and influence couldn't save him now. The prosecution laid out a damning case showing how he had tracked Sheila, hired people to hurt her, and ultimately approved the contract for her murder. After a high-profile federal trial, Blackthorne was found guilty of interstate conspiracy to commit murder and interstate domestic violence. The judge handed him 2 concurrent life sentences without the possibility of parole. No amount of money, power, or manipulation could undo what he had done. Even behind bars, Blackthorne remained a hated figure. In 2001, he was nearly killed by a prison gang. For his own safety, he was moved to a different facility. But prison was his final home. Children grew up without their mother, forever marked by the tragedy of that day. Sheila Bellush's case remains one of the most disturbing and tragic examples of domestic violence, obsession, and revenge. It serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest threats don't come from strangers, but from the people we once loved and trusted. If you found this case compelling and want to hear more real-life crime stories, consider subscribing to the channel. Here, we dive deep into the darkest and most shocking true crime cases, uncovering the details that many overlook. There are many more stories to be told, and together we can bring awareness, justice, and understanding to the crimes that shook the world. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay aware, and I'll see you in the next video.